I did my presentation over Chapter 10 on women's rights in antebellum America. During this time period, women were expected to be submissive, pure, and virtuous. They were considered the spiritual leaders of the home and were supposed to pass those virtues on to their children. Common jobs during this time period for women were education and taking care of the home and raising children. Many stated the obvious conclusion that if women were to educate their children, they must first be educated themselves. Many schools for women had the ultimate end goal of training them to be teachers. This push for education established women's intellectual equality with men, which is an idea that would eventually lead to women's suffrage. Some more outspoken women began to tour the U.S. giving anti-slavery lectures. After facing negative reactions, they decided to stand up for more than the abolition of slavery. They realized that if women were able to vote, they would much more easily reform society. This led to them becoming some of the first women to stand up for women's rights.
Independence asserts the self-evident and universal truth that all men are created equal and have essential, inalienable rights. And even though neither the government nor a fellow citizen can take away one's natural rights, there are other rights granted by the government deemed political rights.
One of the most important political rights is the right to vote, also known as suffrage. Equal citizens have suffrage and thus give consent to make laws in a republican form of government. However, this wasn't always the case.
For a long portion of America's history, men had the right to vote while women did not.
So, how did women achieve equal voting rights? Today, we look at the women's suffrage movement. When the women's suffrage movement began, women had almost no legal rights. They couldn't vote or even serve on juries. They also lacked access to higher education in most professions. In fact, married women at the time were considered covered by the husband's authority, a doctrine known as coverture. And since women were seen as dependent on men, they were refused the right to vote.
Yet, despite this, many women became powerful voices for equality and American principles. Evoking the spirits of revolutionary figures such as Hannah Griffiths and Abigail Adams before them, many women in the 1820s and 30s continued their fight for equality.
In order to do this, women pushed back against the boundaries of the domestic sphere in which they were supposed to be contained. Brave women stepped out of the home to lead or participate in reform movements in a wide range of areas, from education and abolitionism to temperance and prison reform.
For example, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the daughters of a Southern slaveholder, became America's leading female advocates of the abolition of slavery. Another abolitionist, Abby Kelly, was a prominent member of the American Anti-Slavery Society.
In 1840, abolitionists Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Unfortunately, they faced discrimination and weren't even allowed to participate. This only intensified Stanton's desire to fight for equality. After 8 years of organizing, Stanton was one of 300 women who met at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York to assert their equality.
Before the convention, Stanton drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, which opens with the famous line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." A list of grievances demanded equal education and professional opportunities, equal civil rights, the right to hold property, as well as the right to vote. In total, 68 women and 32 men, including Frederick Douglass, signed the Declaration in their cause for equality.
The convention at Seneca Falls resulted in additional conventions for women's suffrage. It also led to the alliance between Stanton and one Susan B. Anthony. Together and alongside hundreds of other women across the country, they led a decades-long struggle for women's suffrage and equality well into the late 1800s.
This struggle, however, wasn't without roadblocks. When the 14th Amendment was passed, Anthony decided to test it by forcing the courts to decide whether it had implicitly enfranchised women. Along with 24 of her peers, she boldly tested it by voting in Rochester, New York, which led to her arrest and conviction. During her trial, Anthony reprimanded the court, stating, "You have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government."
Then, in 1875, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in the Minor versus Happersett case that the 14th Amendment did not enfranchise women. This, coupled with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which granted African American men the right to vote, left women in the suffrage movement dejected, with many feeling that educated white women should have attained voting rights first. These frustrations led some suffragists to make disparaging remarks about the recently enfranchised African American men.
A major divide within the movement was imminent. This, along with pushback from detractors, would create many obstacles on the path to equal voting rights.
How would the suffragists overcome this? We'll get to that in